That's a nasty scar, Sergeant. Did you lose a fight with a machete? Corporal Brett Donovan's cruel laugh echoed across the Camp Liberty Academy training ground as he gestured at the dramatic mark cutting across Elena Blackwood's face. What Donovan didn't know was that the woman he just mocked had taken that blade to her face while saving 30 Iraqi children, and that Colonel James Westbrook, watching from across the field, had been there when it happened. The radio in Elena's tactical vest crackled with an incoming priority message that would force the colonel to break his 4-year silence about Operation Iron Thunder. Because when you mock Falcon 12's scars, the truth has a way of cutting deeper than any blade ever could. Camp Liberty Academy buzzed with the controlled energy of a Tuesday morning training session. The Texas sun beat down on the tactical training ground as instructors prepared for another day of molding the next generation of military leaders. Elena Blackwood stood at attention near the equipment shed, her tactical vest crisp and professional despite the early hour. At 36, she carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd seen real combat. But it was the scar that drew attention. A dramatic line that began at her right eye, sliced through the corner of her mouth and ended at her left chin. For 3 days since her arrival, she'd been the subject of whispered speculation among the other instructors. Car accident, one had suggested. Training mishap, another had offered. Domestic violence was the darker theory making rounds. None of them had guessed the truth. Corporal Brett Donovan had been watching her all week, working up the courage for this moment. At 28, he was younger than most instructors at the academy, but his confidence bordered on arrogance. He'd earned his position through technical skill and political maneuvering rather than combat experience, a fact that both motivated and haunted him. "Hey, Sergeant Blackwood," Donovan called out, loud enough for the other instructors to hear. "I've been meaning to ask, what's the story with the war paint?" Elena turned slowly, her green eyes meeting his with steady composure. She didn't speak. "Come on," Donovan pressed, emboldened by the attention. "We're all curious. Did you lose a fight with a machete? Or maybe a jealous boyfriend with anger management issues?" The other instructors shifted uncomfortably. Staff Sergeant Martinez looked away. Lieutenant Thompson suddenly found his equipment inventory fascinating. Nobody intervened. Elena Blackwood stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind her back, saying nothing. But what they didn't know was that beneath her calm exterior, her mind was somewhere else entirely, back to a dusty playground in Baghdad where children's screams had mixed with the sound of approaching explosions. What they didn't realize was that this woman had volunteered for the most dangerous assignments for 15 years, that she'd spent her last deployment in Iraq specifically requesting bomb disposal missions in civilian areas, that she'd earned the call sign Falcon 12 for her ability to swoop into impossible situations and emerge with lives saved. Across the training field, Colonel James Westbrook watched through his office window, his coffee growing cold in his hands. His jaw tightened as he recognized the familiar cruelty of ignorance. He'd seen it before, warriors being judged by their scars rather than their service. But this was different, because James Westbrook had been there on the day Elena Blackwood earned that scar. He'd been the one coordinating evacuation when the radio calls stopped coming. He'd been the one who found her 3 hours later, face covered in blood, still protecting a group of Iraqi children who called her the angel with the hurt face. The priority message crackled through Elena's radio again. "Falcon 12, this is command. Priority communication required." Elena glanced at the radio, then back at Donovan. "Is there anything else, Corporal?" But what happened next would change everything they thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and what it really means to serve. Donovan wasn't finished. The lack of reaction from Elena only fueled his cruelty, mistaking her dignity for weakness. "Oh, come on, Sergeant. We're all professionals here." He gestured broadly to the gathered instructors. "I mean, if you're going to be teaching combat tactics with a face like that, shouldn't we know the story? What if students ask? What if parents see you at graduation ceremonies?" The words hit the training ground like physical blows. Even the most callous instructors winced at the direct attack on her appearance. But Elena Blackwood didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago that true strength wasn't measured by your ability to strike back, but by your capacity to absorb cruelty without becoming cruel yourself. What none of them understood was that Elena had specifically requested assignment to Camp Liberty Academy. After 15 years of active combat duty, she could have taken any position she wanted. Consulting roles with defense contractors, training positions at prestigious war colleges, even a comfortable Pentagon desk job with her security clearance level. Instead, she'd chosen the hardest assignment available, training the next generation of military leaders. Because Elena Blackwood understood something that couldn't be learned from textbooks, that real leadership isn't about commanding respect through fear, but earning it through example. You know what I think happened? Donovan continued, warming to his theme as other instructors watched in horrified fascination. I think our new sergeant here tried to play with the big boys and found out she wasn't ready for the real thing. Maybe got a little too close to the action, right, Sergeant? Elena's radio crackled again. Falcon 12, command is requesting immediate priority response. This time, several instructors noticed the call sign, Falcon 12. Military call signs weren't random. They were earned through specific actions or characteristics. But none of them recognized this particular designation. What they couldn't know was that Falcon 12 was classified at levels most of them would never achieve, that the operations Elena had conducted were still sealed in Pentagon files marked Eyes Only, that her last mission report was required reading for Special Operations commanders studying urban warfare tactics. Lieutenant Thompson finally found his voice. Donovan, maybe you should... Should what? Donovan snapped. Should pretend we don't all see what's obvious? Look, I respect service as much as anyone, but there's a difference between earning your scars in combat and whatever this is. He pointed directly at Elena's face, his finger inches from the scar tissue. That's when Colonel James Westbrook's office door slammed open. The sound echoed across the training field like a gunshot, freezing every conversation and stopping every movement. Westbrook strode across the distance with purposeful steps, his expression unreadable but somehow dangerous. Elena stood motionless, still saying nothing, but her radio was buzzing insistently now. Priority calls didn't wait for convenient moments. But what Colonel Westbrook was about to reveal would transform not just this conversation, but everyone's understanding of what they were really looking at when they saw Elena Blackwood's scar. Because some marks aren't signs of failure. They're proof of the moment someone chose others' lives over their own safety. Corporal Donovan. Colonel Westbrook's voice cut across the training field with the authority of 25 years in uniform. Every instructor on the ground snapped to attention, recognizing the tone that preceded career-ending conversations. Sir? Donovan's confidence evaporated as he turned to face the approaching colonel. You just asked Staff Sergeant Blackwood about her scar. Westbrook stopped directly in front of Donovan, close enough that the corporal could see the steel in his eyes. You want to know the story behind it? Sir, You were just what, Corporal? Making conversation? Building unit cohesion? Westbrook's voice carried the dangerous calm that experienced officers recognized as barely controlled fury. Elena finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. Colonel, it's not necessary. Oh, but it is necessary, Sergeant. Westbrook never took his eyes off Donovan. Because this corporal thinks he knows what combat looks like. He thinks he can judge a warrior by their scars. The training field had gone completely silent. Even the Texas wind seemed to hold its breath. Tell me, Corporal Donovan, Westbrook continued, have you ever heard of Operation Iron Thunder? Donovan's face went blank. No, sir. Of course you haven't. It's classified at levels you'll never reach. Westbrook began walking slowly around the group of instructors, all of whom were now standing at rigid attention. But I was there. I coordinated that operation from beginning to end. Elena's radio buzzed again. Falcon 12, this is Joint Chiefs Communications Center. Priority Alpha message requires immediate acknowledgement. Several instructors' eyes widened. Joint Chiefs communications were reserved for the highest levels of military leadership. Baghdad, 2019, Westbrook began, his voice carrying across the silent field. Al-Rashid neighborhood, Intelligence indicated a weapons cache hidden near a primary school. Standard protocol would have been to evacuate the area and conduct a controlled demolition. He stopped walking and looked directly at Elena, who remained motionless. But intel was wrong. It wasn't a weapons cache. It was an active IED factory. Insurgents had been building devices literally underneath a school full of children. And when our EOD team arrived for what should have been a routine disposal, Westbrook paused, the memory clearly painful even years later. They walked into an ambush. 3 explosives experts, gone in the first 30 seconds. The insurgents had turned the entire school into a death trap, with 30 Iraqi children caught in the middle. Lieutenant Thompson was the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "What happened to the children?" Westbrook turned back to Elena, and for the first time since arriving at Camp Liberty, she felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. That's when Falcon 12 volunteered to go in alone. The radio crackled once more. "Falcon 12, acknowledge priority communication immediately." But Colonel Westbrook wasn't finished. Because what happened next in that Baghdad schoolyard would explain not just Elena's scar, but why 30 Iraqi families still sent letters to a Pentagon address marked only "For the Angel." Elena Blackwood had already completed 2 tours in Iraq, Westbrook continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. She'd earned a reputation for taking assignments that other EOD specialists wouldn't touch. Urban environments, civilian areas, anywhere that required surgical precision and absolute courage. Elena's hands were clenched tightly behind her back now, her knuckles white with tension. She'd never heard this story told from the outside before. When I radioed for volunteers to enter that school, 47 highly trained soldiers were standing ready. Special Forces operators, Delta Force veterans, Rangers who'd seen combat across 3 continents. Westbrook's eyes found Elena's face, but only one person stepped forward immediately. The training field was so quiet that they could hear the distant sound of traffic from the highway beyond the base. The tactical situation was impossible, Westbrook continued. Insurgents had rigged the building with enough explosives to level a city block. They were holding 30 children hostage in the central courtyard, and they'd positioned shooters in every classroom, every hallway, every possible entry point. Donovan was pale now, beginning to understand that he'd stepped into something far beyond his comprehension. Standard military doctrine says you don't send anyone into that situation. You evacuate the surrounding area, you negotiate, you wait for specialized equipment. You don't risk a single soldier for what? Elena spoke quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the field. For 30 children who never asked to be in the middle of our war? Westbrook nodded grimly. Falcon 12 went in with minimal equipment. Body armor that would slow her down, communications gear that wouldn't work inside the building, and her standard issue knife. Elena's radio crackled again, but this time she reached down and switched it off. This story needed to be finished. "She spent 4 hours inside that school," Westbrook said. 4 hours moving from room to room, disarming devices that could have killed everyone within a quarter mile. 4 hours protecting children who didn't speak her language, but who understood that the American woman with the gentle voice was there to save them. Staff Sergeant Martinez was openly staring now, trying to reconcile the quiet instructor they'd worked alongside with the image of a lone soldier in a building full of explosives. The insurgents made their final stand in the playground. 3 men with automatic weapons and enough explosives to kill everyone in the courtyard. Elena had already evacuated most of the children, but 8 were still trapped. Westbrook's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The leader had a combat knife, 10 inches of sharpened steel, and when Elena moved to shield the children, he gestured toward her face. He cut her from her right eye to her left chin, through her mouth, through nerve tissue that controls half her facial expressions, a wound that should have dropped her instantly. Elena touched the scar reflexively, remembering the moment when hot steel had sliced through flesh and the taste of blood had filled her mouth. But she didn't drop. She fought back, and she won. The silence that followed Westbrook's words was deafening. Every instructor on the training field stood frozen, trying to process what they'd just learned about the woman they'd watched being mocked for 3 days. Elena finally looked up from the ground, her eyes meeting Donovan's for the first time since the confrontation began. There was no anger in her expression, no triumph. Just the quiet dignity of someone who'd never needed external validation because her choices spoke louder than any words ever could. "The blade went through my mouth," she said simply, her voice slightly altered by the nerve damage. "I couldn't speak clearly for 6 months, had to relearn how to eat solid food, physical therapy for basic facial movements." She paused, touching the scar again. But 8 Iraqi children went home to their families that night. Donovan's mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. "How do you apologize for mocking someone who'd taken a blade to the face to save children?" "The insurgent who cut me," Elena continued, "was carrying a dead man's switch connected to enough explosives to collapse the building. When I fought him, when I took that knife to my face, I had to keep fighting until I could disarm the device. Because if I'd passed out, if I'd given up..." She looked around the circle of instructors, meeting each pair of eyes. 30 children would have died. Their teachers, the medical team trying to evacuate wounded, the entire rescue operation. Colonel Westbrook stepped forward. "The Pentagon classified Operation Iron Thunder at the highest levels because Elena's actions that day redefined urban combat protocols. Her tactical choices, her equipment innovations, her psychological approach to hostage situations, it's all required reading now for Special Operations commanders." Elena's switched-off radio suddenly burst to life with an override signal. "Falcon 12, this is Secretary of Defense Harrison. Your presence is required immediately for national security briefing. Priority Alpha 1. Every instructor on the field recognized that name. The Secretary of Defense didn't make personal calls to mid-level staff sergeants, unless they weren't really mid-level staff sergeants. Lieutenant Thompson found his voice first. "Sergeant, ma'am, how many operations like this have you completed?" Elena looked at Westbrook, who nodded slightly. "Operation Iron Thunder was my 14th classified urban combat mission," she said quietly. "I've been called to Washington 17 times in the last 4 years for strategic consultation on hostage situations involving civilians." Staff Sergeant Martinez stepped forward suddenly and saluted. Not the casual salute of military courtesy, but the sharp, precise salute of recognition and respect. One by one, the other instructors followed. Lieutenant Thompson, Sergeant Reynolds, even the maintenance crew who'd been working nearby and overheard the story. Elena stood perfectly still for a moment, then returned the salute with the precision of someone who'd earned every gesture of respect she'd ever received. But Corporal Donovan remained frozen, still trying to comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. If you believe that Elena's courage in Baghdad represents true heroism, type courage in the comments below. Elena turned to answer the Secretary of Defense's call, but Corporal Donovan's voice stopped her. "Sergeant, ma'am, His voice cracked. "I don't know how to apologize for what I said." Elena studied his face for a long moment. She'd seen this expression before. The moment when someone realized that their assumptions about strength and weakness had been completely backwards. "Corporal Donovan," she said quietly, 3 days ago, you saw a woman with a facial scar and made assumptions. That's human nature. But you chose to turn those assumptions into cruelty. That's a choice." The training field remained silent, every person present understanding they were witnessing something that would change them forever. "The children I saved in Baghdad," Elena continued, "they didn't care that I couldn't speak clearly after the knife cut through my mouth. They didn't see my scar as a disfigurement. They saw it as proof that someone cared enough about their lives to bleed for them." She gestured toward the academy buildings surrounding them. "This institution exists to train leaders, real leaders, the kind who understand that strength isn't about having an unmarked face or an unblemished record. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice when others are counting on you." Colonel Westbrook stepped forward. "Effective immediately, Staff Sergeant Elena Blackwood is appointed Chief Instructor of Combat Leadership at Camp Liberty Academy. Her first directive will be implementing new protocols for how this institution treats veterans with visible service-related injuries." Elena's radio crackled again. "Falcon 12, Defense Secretary Harrison is holding. The Joint Chiefs are waiting for your input on the Syria hostage situation." Elena reached for her radio, then paused. Colonel, permission to take this call? Granted, Sergeant, and Elena. Westbrook smiled for the first time that morning. Tell the Secretary that Camp Liberty Academy is proud to have Falcon 12 on our training staff. As Elena walked toward the communications building, Donovan called after her. Sergeant Blackwood, ma'am? She turned back. How do I learn to see what you see? How do I become the kind of leader who protects instead of this? Elena considered the question seriously. You start by understanding that every person you meet is carrying something you can't see. Scars, trauma, stories of courage or pain. Your job as a leader isn't to judge those marks. It's to see the person beneath them and help them become their best version of themselves. She touched her scar one final time. This mark reminds me every day that I chose to put children's lives ahead of my own safety. It's not a disfigurement, Corporal. It's a badge of honor. And someday, when you've earned your own marks through real service, you'll understand the difference. As Elena disappeared into the communications building to brief the Secretary of Defense on counterterrorism tactics, the training field slowly returned to activity. But something fundamental had changed at Camp Liberty Academy. On the bulletin board outside the main administrative building, a new policy appeared that afternoon. Camp Liberty Academy Honor Code. Every scar tells a story of service. Every visible injury represents invisible courage. We judge our warriors not by their unmarked faces, but by their willingness to be marked in service of others. Chief Instructor E. Blackwood, Falcon 12. 3 months later, Corporal Brett Donovan graduated from the Academy's new Leadership Through Service program, a curriculum designed by Elena Blackwood and based on the principle that true strength is measured not by what you can destroy, but by what you're willing to protect. And when new instructors arrived at Camp Liberty Academy, they learned about Falcon 12 before they learned anything else. They learned that the woman with the scarred face serving in their training command had redefined courage for an entire generation of military leaders. Because at Camp Liberty, they now understood that some battles leave marks, but heroes leave legacies. Thank you to everyone who typed courage. Your support honors every veteran who has sacrificed for others. Elena Blackwood chose to take a blade to her face rather than let 30 children die. If stories like this inspire you, please subscribe to help us share more incredible tales of service and sacrifice. Until next time, remember that true courage isn't the absence of scars. It's the willingness to get them protecting others.